Welcome to episode 13 of the In the Name of Service podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Barb Thompson. Here we broadcast stories of men and women who've answered a call to serve in hopes of inspiring and catalyzing the rest of us to follow suit in our own way. Today's interview is with Dr. Donell Barnett. Donell is a husband, father, psychologist in the Army Reserves, mental health administrator for the state of Illinois, and the president of the Association of Black Psychologists. I hope you'll listen to Donell's unique service story, how he moved a long way from home to become the first college graduate of his family, and how he stumbled into role after role, never forgetting to continue learning and exploring along the way. I had the fortune of meeting and living alongside Donell during our doctoral program in psychology at Oklahoma State University. Poor Donell was the only male in our cohort, and he always brought a sense of calm to our stormy days and joy in the midst of chaos. And don't get me started on his amazing singing voice. But anyway, Donell has now grown into a leader in several communities and battles against the current mental health crisis. His wisdom and perspective brought me so much comfort in this conversation as he talks through how he envisions us all working together for brighter days. I hope you will heed his advice when he says to just jump into action when it comes to using your unique position in this world, and that you truly do believe that you were born for a purpose, as he says. Thank you for listening. Welcome, Donell, to the In the Name of Service podcast. It is my greatest honor and pleasure to have you on today. If you could start us off by just telling us a bit about yourself, your background, and kind of what's led you to the place you're in today.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am Donell Barnett, and originally from Chicago. And finished high school, all of that sort of thing. Went away to college in Oklahoma, undergrad at Langston University.
It's a little bit of a change from Chicago to Oklahoma.
Just a little bit. It was a pivotal part of my story and my life. Oklahoma, I got to meet you, and it just a lot of great things happened because of that cultural and geographical shift that I don't think would have happened in the same way had I stayed in Chicago for college and so forth. But did the master's at University of North Texas and a doctorate at Oklahoma State University. I am a psychologist, a counseling psychologist by training, and that has led me into a lot of different places. Psychology is really aligns with who I am as a person. I'm oriented towards helping people. That's kind of my personality. And if I were not a psychologist, I probably would have been a teacher or a social worker or, something like that. That's, just a part of how I'm built. And you said what brought me to where I am.
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, but...
Yeah. So where I am is kind of a couple different things. I am the father of Kendall. I am the husband of LaShonda. I am the son of Roy and Felicia. I serve in a number of places. I consider myself to be a minister in the sense of serving people in the way that I believe that my faith tradition calls me to, compels me to. I am the president of the Association of Black Psychologists, and I serve as a mental health administrator for the state of Illinois.
Okay. Now, originally I was going to ask you what initially led you into the military, but now I'm curious. Yeah. I'm curious. Don't worry, we'll get to that. I'm curious about you wanting to go into a helping profession. Like, where do you think that came from for you? That desire to help others or serve others?
I think it comes from a few different places. Growing up in Chicago, especially during the 80s and 90s, many of our urban cities were really reeling from the HIV epidemic, the crack epidemic, certainly a lot of violence that came from a lot of different directions, sort of institutional violence,
right,
community violence, those sorts of things. And so that was sort of a context that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And I think made me a little more aware and a little more sensitive to just the struggles that people were having, just negotiating life. So that kind of had an imprint on me. I very early on, like high school, I was brought into a grant-funded position from a community center in my neighborhood. At the time, they were doing what's called HIV peer counselors. So like teenagers would go and talk with other teenagers about safe sex practices and cleanings, like we were doing stuff like that when I was like 14, and that was just a job that just real small part-time, like really like 4 hours a week, like nothing real major, but it again sensitized me to real struggles, real problems that people deal with. I mentioned that I'm a Christian, and in that context, my household was oriented that way in terms of food drives, clothing drives, going out to support people, that sort of thing. And it was sort of the infusion of those early experiences that really gave me a sense of responsibility beyond just sort of what I do. And then, my personality, who sort of knows? Who sort of knows where that comes from? But it was a collection of, some early experiences in life and just kind of who I am as a person that led me down the path. Now, I am a first-generation college student, and so I didn't really have a lot of models to say, this is how you choose a major, and this is how you decide on which professor to study under, right? Like all of that stuff I had to figure out on my own.
Right.
So actually becoming a psychologist, I kind of stumbled into, quite frankly. But, that was sort of a part of the pathway leading here. And ultimately, by the time I was old enough and had enough training, I sort of figured out how to take the helm where things weren't as haphazard, or I didn't sort of, wasn't stumbling my way through it. But I started to realize there was a point at which that I realized, okay, I have this foundation, and now I can sort of steer it in a direction that I think is right for me.
Yeah. And well, I guess part of that journey is steering right into the Army. What initially led you to serve in that capacity? Yeah,
initially after my first year of college, I went back home to Chicago, and my mom was like, I can't afford it for me to continue to go to school. And I had already caught the Oklahoma bug at that point. And so like literally the next day I called the recruiter and it's like, hey, what you got? And they said, well, we have this, and this kind of job is available. So that year, that was the summer of '98, I took off the fall semester of school, went to basic training and AIT, joined the reserves, and then went back to school in Oklahoma that following spring, and that's how it started. And from there, I stayed in the reserves through undergrad and through the master's degree. And by the time I got to my doctoral program, I had a break in service because I finished my initial reserve term. And I found out, the country was really sort of scaling up for Afghanistan. And so a lot of recruitment for psychologists, for optometrists, dentists, physicians. Right? There was a lot of recruitment happening at that time. I found out about a program to come on to active duty, and I said, well, hey, I know something about this. I know something about the military. I was enlisted, of course, for that first 8 years, but coming back on active duty, or coming on active duty as an officer and as a psychologist, it was very different from my enlisted time. But, I knew.
What was your MOS?
I was an 88 mic truck driver.
Okay.
Yeah, and I went to Iraq as a truck driver in 2003 during that initial term, and then came back, finished school, and started at OSU, took the program to become a psychologist on active duty, and that was it. That took me through the next 9 years.
Right.
After that point, yeah.
And then you deployed again to Afghanistan, right?
Deployed again to Afghanistan in 2011. 10. The years blend. Yeah, it's like
there was a lot going on. Yeah.
There was a lot going on, yes.
When you think back or reflect back on your military career, what have you found to be the most meaningful event or period of time?
Wow. One of the things that I often go back to is in Afghanistan, right? We are, in mental health, we're sort of trained in sort of traditional ways of doing that work. You bring people into an office setting, you have, a block of time that you're going to do an intervention, and you kind of do this whole elaborate treatment plan and all of that sort of thing. But in Afghanistan, it was, can you find 10 minutes to talk to someone outside of a bunker?
Yeah.
It was, right, can you find, catch someone at the chow hall for a few minutes, right? It was much more human, less sterile. It was being sensitive to what people needed in the moment. And that shaped sort of how I thought about the profession and just sort of how people interact. It shaped me in really critical ways. Just helped me to understand that a lot of what people need is someone who will listen, someone who will be supportive, someone who will help them figure out problems and struggles. Like they're not, you may have a diagnosis, if you will, but that diagnosis doesn't define every problem that you have.
Right.
Right. Right. So it's that was something that I always come back to, especially now in my career when I do much more higher level kind of administrative leader level work. I always try to balance that. Yes, there's evidence based. Yes, there is formal systems and interventions and that sort of thing. But what undergirds all of that is the willingness to be present with somebody and to talk to them and to be a friend in a lot of ways, to be a wise friend. I'll say it that way.
Yeah. It's earning someone's genuine trust is not a 3 or 5 step process. Yeah. Yeah. Can you take us through your decision to exit the military? Just at the period of time when you did, you said it was like 9 years basically later, and you had some reserve time before that. So that's a big decision, as most people know, like you get that 20 years and then you have some kind of security after that. So can you take us through that and why you exited one form of service and into another? Yeah,
well, I am back in the reserves now. So I'm still in, and I'm at 23 years, something like that.
Awesome.
I got my 20-year letter.
Yay.
But so it was a couple things that influenced the decision. Probably the biggest reason was after. So when I got to Afghanistan, I was a captain. But the position that I was in was a lieutenant colonel billet. And then from Afghanistan, I went to Germany, and I had the same thing. I was still a captain, but in a lieutenant colonel billet. From Germany, I went to Army Public Health Center, and it was the same deal. I was captain. I got promoted to major at that point, but the slot that I was in was a lieutenant colonel. And so by the time I was almost done with my term with that rotation in Maryland, I was still an early major, but the experiences that I had was above my literally
pay grade, as they say. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I talked with the consultant, and he said that, the next logical job for you is like a senior lieutenant colonel job, just kind of based on your career trajectory. The next logical job is mid-career, late stage lieutenant colonel. But there is no way I can put a major in any slots that would be available for your job. And so because I had kind of skipped over captain's level job, he said, I would have to go back and sit out a cycle to take a lower job so that my rank and my career trajectory could catch up, and then the following cycle I would be about ready. When I became an actual lieutenant colonel, then I could take an actual lieutenant colonel job, and that was not appealing to me. So that was one factor. And then I had a kid at the time. Well, I still have a kid, but I was thinking a lot about my sons growing up with family, and so coming back home to Chicago was really attractive to kind of allow him to be along with family. And then the other thing that was really pressing on me, I was starting to feel a calling towards community work. At every duty station that I had been at, I always joined a local church. I had always tried to figure out some ways to plug into the local community no matter where I was stationed, and my heart really is in community kind of work.
Yeah.
And so I saw that that is an opportunity to transition home to Chicago, where I could solve for all of those problems. Doing community work, I could be around family, and I had an opportunity to my career was much more at my discretion. I didn't I had more control over if I felt I was ready for a job with higher responsibility, I could go after it, and there was no and compete like everyone else does. So those were some of the factors that contribute to me leaving active duty, and of course I knew I could still continue in the reserves with it now.
Yeah. And from the many perspectives you have now, like where you sit in all the communities that you're a part of, what have you seen or discerned to be some of the greatest needs currently?
Yeah, well, I think coming out of COVID and what people are framing as the mental health crisis, I think it is part of an awakening that people are struggling at levels that we didn't quite understand. And I think we understand better now than we did, say, pre-COVID. But folks are struggling with a lot of everyday kinds of things. And that, I think, more than anything, is one of the realizations that I try, wake up most days thinking a lot about, is how our systems really are designed for folks who have insurance.
You're right.
Our systems are designed for folks who have access and means. Our systems are designed for folks who have the wherewithal to, stop whatever it is that they're doing during the day and go and make an appointment with somebody to address whatever the issue it is. And for all of the people who don't fit into those categories, they don't have access, they don't have means, they're not insured, or they're underinsured, or they have grown up in a context where these kinds of supports were not available to them or to their families. And so in many cases, they're trying to navigate systems that they don't have a level of fluency in. And consequently, they go for years without support, without help, without access. And so that problem set really fuels a lot of, how I think about all the work that I do and everything that I'm involved in. And so that may be a little bit beyond the question that you asked, but that's sort of how all of this maps out in this brain of mine.
That is, when you talk about that problem, it seems overwhelming. Like, it seems too big. So I guess I'm curious now about, how do you see the solutions, coming about, or what's your vision for how to kind of move forward, doing something to combat the needs that you see?
Yeah, so there is a lot of, one of the areas that I get to champion is healing circle work. For many cultures around the world and throughout history. So, someone explained it to me this way: for every community right now and throughout history that didn't have a psychiatrist, what did they do when someone had a behavioral health problem? Right. For every community around the world now, present day, and throughout history, if they didn't have a physician, what did they do when someone got sick? They developed their own indigenous ways of support, of healing, of practicing. And the wisdom of realizing that, hey, we can do this. Right. If you don't know that a psychiatrist exists, that doesn't mean that you ignore mental health problems, right?
Yeah, right.
That means you start to think about ways of support. And sometimes communities will say, okay, this person has this, but they are still a part of the community. That they're not ostracized in the way that we stigmatize a lot of mental illness today. Right, they embrace them in community, and the opposite is true too, where people who have had certain mental health challenges have been severely harmed in some communities, before we sort of understood it the way that we do. But the point is that when you strip away all of the access and all of the ways that we think about helping people, then come to a way of looking at communities, of systems, of how people practice and how people support one another in the absence of professional help. And one way that has happened in many different cultures is healing circles, is what some folks call it, but it's essentially gatherings when communities come together to talk through problems, to offer support, to rely on their ways of being, their ways of believing, their ways of moving, and use that to offer principles around living. And that then helps people, whether they have a mental health problem or not, it helps them to navigate the problem that they have in front of them right now.
Right. Yeah.
And if you help people navigate the problem that they have in front of them right now, over the course of time, people do better. They survive and they thrive.
They learn.
They learn. And from a Christian tradition, there's a scripture that says, I shouldn't have called this reference out because now I'm drawing a blank on what
That's right. None of us are experts, so.
Yes, in this world there will be problems, but take comfort, for I have overcome the world. And the statement essentially is a calling. Part of the statement is essentially a calling to understand that there is no escaping not having problems.
Right. Yeah.
Disabuse yourself of that thought. You will have problems. There will be trials. There will be tribulations. And I think that in and of itself is incredibly powerful to some people. Yeah. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I love that. I think what I love about it most is that this huge problem is solved by everyday people.
Yes. Thank you.
It's just every one of us. I love that. And there's no special qualifications. You can just sit with a person who's having trouble, create a relationship, and then on the day that you have trouble, you might be able to reach back out.
Yeah. And it is that sense of community that is, I think, is a critical component, even in just purely American history. We are a lot more isolated. The Surgeon General has talked about this epidemic of loneliness.
Right.
The former Surgeon General has talked about this epidemic of loneliness and how that contributes to a whole range of behavioral health problems, formal behavioral health and informal behavioral health problems. We are not as communal as perhaps we were, even 3 or 4 generations ago.
Yeah.
Certainly in an African American context where not too long ago my ancestors were shut out of systems and they relied on themselves entirely to support one another. And thankfully, that is a cultural tradition that has been a part of the Black experience even before America. And so, so in a lot of ways, that's it's a tradition that has been around for centuries, if not longer, coming from African traditions. And so living in an American context where you don't have access to the latest and greatest and all the resources, whether you are, because you come from a poor background or other cultural backgrounds, or lots of communities have survived that way. It's harder to do that today, though. Because again, systems take certain assumptions, assumption that you have insurance, assumption that you know how to navigate the healthcare system, assumption that you are, you have a certain individualism and a certain independence.
Or even have like the awareness or knowledge to show up at the right doctor's doorstep.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
And oh, by the way, there's not enough providers of a whole variety of types of providers to go around for all the problems that, people show up, if they do show up, at the right doorstep at the right time.
How are you seeing people connect to these healing circles?
So they are done virtually. Is one of the ways that people connect, because they're virtual. The pandemic, obviously has pushed a lot of things into the virtual space, which created opportunities to have more ways for people to engage. So, even if it's a scheduled Zoom call where people, they sign up, they come in, they get a little check-in, and they get some support from the community. And it gives them enough to go back out there and face the week.
Yeah.
Face the day, right? Some communities are holding, these kinds of meetings where, healing circles is sort of one name to use, but the principle of having community space to hold conversations, to hold support for folks happens in a lot of different ways, in faith communities, in certain cultural contexts. A lot of times people, for a lot of folks who go to barbershops, right? Barbershops have been a place for community conversation. You wouldn't call it mental health. You wouldn't call it, I'm going to my support group at the barbershop, right? You wouldn't call it that. But in a lot of ways, these spaces are used in that way, and people get, they get to allow other people to pour back into their cup. And that sustains them for a little bit more. And I don't mean that to minimize depression, anxiety,
of
suicide.
course.
Right. I don't mean PTSD. That's not to minimize that, but it is to say that even folks with that level of clinical problems, they still have everyday problems too,
right?
Of kids and jobs and relationships, and all those things happen to everyone, and so we all could benefit from being more person and community centered.
Right. Yes. I mean, hearing you kind of how you've discerned the problems that we're talking about, kind of big big problems and small problems too. And being a leader in different contexts and different communities. Whenever you're discouraged, like what do you go to? What keeps you motivated to continue to serve, to continue to try to tackle some of these bigger issues?
I still feel like I think a lot about calling and purpose, and I still consider myself as one who is learning what I ought to do and be trying to unpack what it is that, why am I here, and how am I uniquely positioned to do only what Donell has been called to do. That helps me to keep going, to keep exploring, to keep understanding, and to keep trying, and appreciating that you may never get it right, you may never have the magic sauce, right? And some people do find like this great big thing that changes the world or changes community, right? Some people do stumble into those things. I don't see myself as someone who is going to, before Donell and after Donell, right? There's no BC, BD. I don't see myself in that way, but I do see that there is something that is unique to me, and if I can keep learning what that is and keep trying to do that, that tells me that every morning I can wake up with a degree of purpose and get after it.
What counsel would you have for the person listening who feels a conviction or a call to serve or, do something, take some kind of action, but doesn't know where or how to get started?
Get started somewhere. That, like I said, a lot of this I stumbled into.
Right.
And I'm very clear about that. And so if it's a homeless shelter or a food pantry or a women's shelter or a march, a movement, go and do that, whatever it is. And what you'll find is people who are also trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
And in conversation with those people who are also trying to figure out, you learn about new opportunities. You learn about other things. You learn about other ways of serving. And over the course of just trying things out, something will strike a chord in you, because everyone needs to understand you were uniquely created and designed for purpose. Everyone has purpose and a unique contribution. And the process of exploring what that is helps to give you a kind of focus and makes you better at whatever it is you ultimately end up doing, because now you become aware of all these other ways in which that your purpose connects with other people's issues and other people's struggles. And so, I encourage people to just jump in somewhere. It could be random, but jump in somewhere and get back up the next day and jump in and just continue to jump in. And it is my belief that your uniqueness will find you, and you'll know when you have gotten to what it is.
Yeah, that's so encouraging, because it's easy to look at just honestly someone like you who looks kind of like you're at, the top of your game and you kind of always knew what you wanted to do. But to hear that you don't have it figured out yet, you're still exploring, mm-hmm. and that even so, the positions that you're in, it's just taken a lifetime of stumbling from one thing to the next and just being reflective and learning along the way. So awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And remember to have fun. Remember to take time off to go do a water slide, or, race your kids there was a probably 5 years ago, I could race my son halfway down the block. Now I can race him about 4 or 5 houses, and that's about,
See you later.
about all he's going to get with me. Right? You got to have fun too, and so balancing those things, I think you'll find the journey for life much more fulfilling, much more meaningful. And oh, by the way, it has a way of inoculating for your own mental health as well.
Yes.
Giving back, serving, has a way. Inoculation is probably not the best word, but it has a way of warding off a lot of your own stresses and pressures and worries by giving you perspective, by giving you meaning, by giving purpose. Serving is selfish in that way.
Right. Well, okay. I've taken up enough of your time on vacation, so I'm going to end it there. But I just want to thank you again for your time. I want to thank you for every role that you've served in, and just your humility and willingness, your courage to continue to tackle the problems that you see in front of you.
Thank you. I am honored to be a part of this, and I'm glad to be a part of your purpose and your calling for what you're doing with this podcast.